to Elevate Maryland, a podcast with Maryland focus and Howard County roots. My name's Tom Cole, and I'm here with my co-host, Candace Dotson-Reed. Candace, how are you doing today?
I'm good. I feel like we're sort of, hitting our stride with these shows now. It's, we're used to, how we are going to work, and Zoom is working well. And I feel like our listeners are getting, really solid guests that we're able to book, maybe because everyone's home. But we're happy to have Randy Shaw, who's joining us from the West Coast. He's an author and housing activist, and we're going to dig right into your wheelhouse, housing. I know you're really happy about that, and I'm glad to have Randy on the show with us.
So excited to have Randy on. Really loved his book, Generation Priced Out, which we're going to be talking about today. Really just, it's something that I think all progressives, anyone who cares about housing should be reading, and I will be recommending it to many of my friends. So it's going to be a great interview, and it's kind of like my Christmas when we get someone like Randy on. But a bit of log rolling to start. So we had our newsletter, Elevated Voices, which has a great response. We're gaining about 10% in subscribers per day, and that came out on Sunday, so that's really exciting. But we've also started a YouTube channel, and the reason for that is because that's where a lot of our audience likes to consume our podcast or our web series via video. And I don't think it's because I'm particularly good looking, but so Candace, all those people in. But the way YouTube works is we get more tools, we get better features on YouTube, the more subscribers we get. So I'm setting a goal for Elevate Maryland to get to 100 subscribers by 2021.
I love it.
So you're going to hear me bugging people about that. We have our Elevate mini shows, which are on there. So they're not just our podcast. We have the mini interviews. And then the production that I put into those videos, there's a little bit extra content. So I hope everyone, if you're an elevator, go check out that on YouTube. It's also a way to catch up on our shows because they play them one after another. You don't need to go and find the next one.
Yep.
So please check it out. Even if you don't use YouTube that much, go and give us a subscribe. If you have a Google account, you have a YouTube account. I would very much appreciate that. And Candace, I think I could speak for you and say you would appreciate it as well, right?
I would, and I need to give you a shout out because you did great work on the newsletter, great work on our YouTube channel. And so thank you for doing that. Just additional tools in the Elevate arsenal, for lack of a better term.
You got it. Want to go into our three things?
I do. Am I kicking it off?
Why don't you? Yeah.
All right, I'm going to kick it off. We're going to talk about Pulitzer Prizes because exciting news. Baltimore Sun won a Pulitzer, and it was for the reporting of the Healthy Holly scandal and all that sort of went along with that. And I think I said this on Twitter, and I'll say it again, it's never great that a scandal is something that wins Pulitzer. However, I'm beyond thrilled that our friends at the Baltimore Sun were recognized for their level of thoughtful reporting as this all came to light. And so, I know we wanted to shout them out. The other person I wanted to shout out, and I sort of fangirl over Nikole Hannah-Jones for her work in the New York Times Magazine for 1619, which tells the story of Black Americans and the history, starting with the first enslaved Africans, which was actually in 1619. And so I know that she was thrilled because I think Ida B. Wells, who was a Black journalist, died in the 1930s, I believe. And I know that she was also given a Pulitzer yesterday as well. And so I know Nikole Hannah-Jones, that means a lot to her because she actually has a Ida B. Wells Society for Black journalists or minority journalists. And so just really excited to see both the Baltimore Sun and Nikole Hannah-Jones recognized for their work. And it was, I kind of screamed out loud. I was like, "Woo, yay." And we've had Luke Broadwater on the show, and he's been a previous guest, as I mentioned on Twitter, and just really happy for them.
Yeah, no, it was a great year for minority voices with the Pulitzer. Also, gosh, I can't remember his first name, but the author of the Nickel Boys received his second Pulitzer.
Oh, yeah.
After the Underground Railroad. And I read Underground Railroad and Nickel Boys. I thought they both were fantastic books. There was a playwright who received the Pulitzer as well. So, you know, it is really great to see these voices being recognized and promoted, elevated. I think you had on Twitter that you were conflicted about the Baltimore Sun getting the Pulitzer, and you also said how happy you were for those those journalists being recognized, and so Randy, I think we now have you on both your computer, and it's fine.
You know, I'm trying to turn my computer off. So let me see if I can.
All right, you're good. I
got it off. Okay, it's off.
Wonderful. Thank you, Randy. But yeah, I mean, it's great to see and good for them. We're happy for them. And it's not that we take anything away from their work when we say we're conflicted. It's more a matter of Baltimore City. It's a dark chapter in Baltimore City's history. And it's something that this election cycle, they have an opportunity to move on from.
Absolutely.
But more power to the Baltimore Sun.
Yes, and before you go on to what you're thinking about, Colson Whitehead. Really.
There we go. Thank you.
What are you thinking about?
So I'm thinking about, and I shared this article, op-ed on Facebook, which is about how there are all these conspiracy theories, and if you spend any time on social media, I mean, conspiracy theories are legion, but they have been more pronounced and more echoed during COVID-19 times than otherwise, or at least it feels that way. And this editorial analysis was sort of pointing out that the reason is that conspiracy theories are often rooted in a sense of helplessness and fear, and that the people that are sharing these conspiracy theories are trying to get some foundation and certainty in a uncertain and uncomfortable environment. So saying that COVID-19 is created by the Democrats in order to hurt Donald Trump, saying that COVID-19 was created by the Chinese to hurt the United States, saying that it's overblown and that it is being overblown to hurt Donald Trump. All of these theories, which there is the bulk of science, including public health officials, that say this is wrong, you're wrong, these conspiracy theories are wrong, but they ignore the bulk of science because that is uncomfortable, that is uncertainty, it is fear, and instead they replace that with some backwoods internet sites analysis that says actually it's this, and now you're the only one that knows, and you're so superior to all these sheep that are following their public health officials. So I empathize with that, and how I shared it on Facebook, and now I'm a little bit more comfortable with those conspiracy theories that previously were making me very angry, because now I empathize with those folks, and I can sort of be like, listen, you're scared, you feel discomforted, and you don't know what tomorrow's gonna be like. I feel the same way, but you are filling in that space with information that for whatever reason you have found credible, and you're leaning on that to give yourself comfort.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting when you sent that article to and posted it, and I read it. I thought about I call this a leadership challenge too. It's certainly fear, but there's also a leadership challenge, because I think if we had leaders in our country right now at the national level who were saying, here's the science, and here's why we're doing these things, why we're staying home, why we're recommending masks, why social distancing is important. I think if we had leadership who was driving the conversation, some of these conspiracy theories would go down. Not all of them, because there are going to be people who make things up. But when you have national leaders also saying that this came from the Chinese and perhaps was created by them to hurt the United States, when you have national leaders spouting that kind of rhetoric, it adds to the problem, and it adds to the fear that folks have. And so you know, there's fear is a piece of it, sure. But I think there's also a leadership problem. And I think, I hope we rectify that in November, but I think it's important for our leaders to be using facts and telling the truth, and using science to back the decisions that they're making. And that's just not happening right now.
Yep. That is true. Do you want me to round out 3 things, or you want to land?
Go for it. You
right.
Start off with that one.
So the third thing is, we got some delegates and Reopen Maryland LLC that have sued state of Maryland and Governor Hogan, telling them to reopen, saying that they are infringing upon their civil rights, their right to go see Sonic the Hedgehog at a movie theater. And they are seeking an injunction against the governor's stay-at-home order. Joined among them are Howard County's own delegate Warren Miller. This is literally a copy of another lawsuit that was filed in Virginia. And we know this because the fine lawyer, and I think it was actually Delegate Cox himself, who drafted the complaint, failed to do the Control F to make sure that, or control the replace function to take out Northam and put in Hogan. It's funny for a few reasons. One of which is that the Republican Party supposedly is against frivolous lawsuits, and this is nothing if not that. The second thing is that there is this rift in the Maryland Republican Party, and it has existed for a long time, because we do need to remember that when Hogan ran in his primary, he was treated as being too moderate, too far to the left. And so that rift has always persisted, and now it's sort of showing its head again. And I think that, and maybe some will say this is unfair, for anyone to look at this as anything other than a political stunt by a few state legislators who want to move themselves up the ranks of projected gubernatorial candidates 2 years hence. I mean, that's what it is. And so obviously interesting to see Warren Miller hitch his wagon to this, considering how narrowly he was reelected, despite having a substantial war chest, in a district that is becoming more blue by the election cycle. But also just a shame that Governor Hogan has to deal with this within his own party, and put us all in danger, because lawsuits, I think this lawsuit is dumb, but as I tell my clients all the time, there is never a guaranteed outcome in a lawsuit. There is never a guaranteed win. There's never a guaranteed loss. So this lawsuit, in effect, puts us all at danger. And shame on them. Shame on them for filing this. Shame on them for pushing this narrative, this conspiracy theory, because it's just frivolous.
The only thing I'm going to add to that is that I feel like Governor Hogan is doing a good job and is focused on keeping people safe in our state. The lawsuit feels overtly political and doesn't seem like they care about keeping people safe in our state. I mean, it doesn't make sense to me. I just read something. I just saw that Ocean City, the mayor in Ocean City, is going to open up the boardwalk and the beach this weekend.
Yep, beaches are opening up.
Yeah, and I'm like, again, leadership, pay attention to the science. I'm glad our governor is doing that, and I hope he continues to lead in that way and not allow strange political pressure to push him to do something different. So
yep.
That's all I have to say about
Would
that.
you like to welcome our guest to the show, Candace?
I would. And with that, I would like to officially welcome our guest to the show. Randy Shaw is an attorney, author, and activist who lives in Berkeley, California. He is the executive director of the Tenderloin Housing Clinic, a nonprofit organization in San Francisco that he co-founded in 1980. He has also co-founded and is on the board of directors of Uptown Tenderloin, Inc., a nonprofit organization that spearheaded the creation of the National Uptown Tenderloin Historic District in 2009. His newest book, Generation Price Out, has recently been released in paperback. Generation Priced Out urges America's most progressive cities to stop pricing out the working and middle class. His book tells powerful stories of tenants, politicians, homeowners groups, developers, and activists in over a dozen US cities impacted by the national housing crisis. From San Francisco to New York City, Seattle to Denver, and Los Angeles to Austin, Generation Priced Out lays out a roadmap for progressive cities to reverse rising economic and racial inequity and inequality. And with that, thank you for joining us, Randy. We appreciate having you here.
Thanks for having me.
Good. So before we get into your book, which I know Tom is very anxious to do, I would like to hear a little bit more about your story. You're clearly passionate about these issues and also have a bit of a contrarianism in what you're doing. So what drew you to housing activism?
Well, I got involved in tenant stuff and representing tenants and working for rent control back in the 1970s. So I've gone way back on the issues that we hear about to protect tenants. And then when I was in law school, we started an organization called the 1001 Housing Clinic. And then after I graduated law school, I got a grant and I became the first full-time employee. We now have 350 employees. And most of what we do, we have a law office that represents tenants facing eviction, but we also, most of our employees are involved in housing homeless people. And so I've developed these programs over the years to house homeless people in San Francisco. We house over 2,000 right now. And so I've always been in housing because I've always seen housing as like the foundational issue. There's a lot of talk now about, well, vulnerable people with overcrowding and homelessness and they have health problems, but there's always been a housing health connection. There's a housing education connection. And for a lot of reasons, which you might want to get into, the federal government has not treated housing respectfully like it does in other countries. So we have just had a long-standing housing crisis in this country, which we need to deal with.
Can I dig a little deeper already? Can we go a little deeper on the, yeah, so talk a little bit more about the housing crisis that we have in this country, because I think our listeners would appreciate that.
I think the most important fact that people should know is that 75% of eligible households for federal funding assistance for the rent, 75% do not get it. That means 25% do, but we wonder about why people are in overcrowded units, why they're having to leave schools and look for housing, why they get evicted so often. Because they're entitled to federal aid, which since the Reagan administration, the federal government hasn't provided. And the numbers of unhoused people keep going up, the number of ill-housed people keep going up, because the federal government has, which is since 1949 claimed to be responsible for this, has abandoned it. And even when we had Clinton and Obama for 16 years, the money barely changed to make up for it. We have never had a president come in and say, we're going to finally deal with this and go back to the funding levels per capita that we had in the 1950s. That's all we need to do. And when a problem lasts in this society for a long time, many in the public assume, well, we must have tried to spend the money and it must have failed. Instead of the fact, no, we never really got the money we needed to solve the problem.
Yeah, so let's dig into the book. I really enjoyed it, and as I said at the beginning of the show, I'm going to be recommending it to many others. And this is something I study because it's part of my work. I've read other books on housing, such as Matthew Desmond's book Evicted, and others, Color of Law, which you referenced many times in your book. Those tend to focus on identifying the housing crisis and proposing solutions. Your book, what I appreciated about it was it took it a step further and identified that there's an actual crisis within the progressive movement as it relates to housing. Could you describe that for us?
Well, I think there is a big problem in cities like San Francisco, where there's many people who identify as political progressives who believe that building market rate housing is bad and causes gentrification. And I've spent my entire career fighting gentrification, and we actually have preserved the neighborhood I work in. San Francisco's Tenderloin is the only neighborhood in San Francisco that will never be gentrified. So I know about gentrification. And as I explain in the book, most neighborhoods in all cities, New York, Los Angeles, Seattle, Chicago, most neighborhoods gentrify without building anything. The story of the big evil developer coming in and knocking down affordable housing, that does happen. And in urban renewal in the 50s and 60s, it happened a lot. But the neighborhoods in, say, in San Francisco, the famous Haight-Ashbury or the Marina District or Pacific Heights, they completely gentrified. They didn't build one unit almost. And so, but yet nevertheless, there's this perception that the villain is the developer. And what has happened in places like California, or take Los Angeles, where they added 1 million people since 1970, 1 million people, and barely built any housing to house them. So when you continue to add population and jobs, as all the cities, Austin, all the cities I write about in the book have done, and you don't build housing for that population, then the people coming for those jobs compete with working and middle class people and outbid them for the existing supply. So to me, opposing market rate housing is usually the wrong move and has actually facilitated gentrification.
And you touch on this in the book as it relates to the generational divide, which we'll get into a little bit later. But I also think there's something about progressives, and I know many of our listeners don't like it when I say this, but there is a thread of progressivism that wants to give people more, but is not willing to give anything up. Is that manifesting itself in this crisis, in this conflict?
Well, absolutely, because you have a generation of progressive boomers who like their single-family home neighborhoods and don't want housing to be built. And I describe in the book how the whole homeowner movement, neighborhood preservation movement, began in Berkeley in the early 70s, and they referred to, we're out there to stop these ticky-tack apartments. And what I say in the book is that those ticky-tack apartments are where the people working for UC could afford to live, where the janitors, where the teachers could afford to live. But there's this attitude like, we're going to make our lives just perfect. We're going to limit traffic. We're going to prevent apartments. But what about the people you're saying have to then commute an hour to get to work? And what does that do for the environment? You know, there's a lot of disconnect among progressive boomer environmentalists who don't see commuting that they cause by planning housing as they don't realize it. And so there's really a disconnect between a generation of progressives and the actual policies. And that's why I wrote Generation Priced Out, because the victims of that is really the millennial generation.
Can we talk a little bit more about that? In the way you describe it, it almost seems like a hoarding of wealth. Boomers have these expensive homes that were affordable when they bought them, but now outside of the reach of new graduates and young folks. And so what can be done about that? And are we explaining that right?
Well, I think you are. I think that it's not true in every city, but in places, in so many of the neighborhoods I write about, in the gentrified neighborhoods, nothing gets built. And so there's a scarce fixed supply of housing, which they happen to have. And so the values of these properties, in San Francisco, the average house now goes for $1.7 million. That's the median. Why has it gone up so much? And people say, we don't want more luxury housing. The biggest supply of luxury housing in every city is the long-term homes. It's the housing on the West Side where they don't have anything built in New York. It's neighborhoods in Seattle where nothing's allowed to get built. So it's very profitable to stop development because you have a scarce resource. There's only so many houses in this neighborhood and you bid up the price. And meanwhile, a new generation comes along, which, I mean, when I went to, I am a boomer. When I went to college at UC Berkeley, the tuition was $212.50 a quarter.
Woo.
$650 a year. Now it's $15,000. So what we're saying to the younger generation is we're going to strap you with major student loan costs, which the previous generations didn't have, and we're going to make your housing a lot more expensive. Best of luck. And that's what my book tries to get. And I think that's why we see so many younger people involved in trying to get more housing built, because they realize they need to increase supply so they can afford to live in these cities where their jobs are.
You also take on another, I guess, sacred cow, and that is the democratic participation in the approval of new housing, and sort of how what I went and I chased down a rabbit hole of videos from that park or the quote park in New York City that had been leased to a art gallery.
Haven Green. That
yes.
I write about.
What was it again?
Haven Green, the project in Nolita.
Yes, and then later on was opposed because it had become sort of, the community knew there was going to be housing there, so instead they decided to lift up the value of this park. So what is it about? Is there a solution for that where the public still is able to participate in zoning and land use yet we don't run into the problem which you identify over and over in the book, which is that everybody quote wants affordable housing, just not here. How do we get past that?
Well, I think one thing that has to be done is to change the process where you have Thursday afternoon meetings and that working people can't attend, where they decide students. I mean, there's been books since my book came out written about the whole, in city after city, what I write about. You have a disproportionate number of older white homeowners who attend those events.
Neighborhood Defenders is a big book.
Yeah, exactly. And I write about a remarkable video that occurred from a guy who does Wedge Live. He actually photographs, he videos these hearings in Minneapolis, and you hear all these people, and they're coming up, and they're literally breaking down and crying. I describe it in the book. I mean, they're crying. They're fearful for their children. And if you watch this video, you think, wait, are they putting a halfway house in this neighborhood? Is this a new homeless shelter? And you find out it's a 10-unit market rate housing project in an 80% renter district. Mm-hmm. So the process by which we allow economically self-interested homeowners to decide what gets built in their neighborhood is a deeply troubling one. And a part of related to that, Tom and Candace, part of that problem, which I describe also in the book, is so many cities have had election cycles where the elections for local officials, the council members, occur in off-year, odd elections where the turnout, even from renter majority neighborhoods, is disproportionately to the elections homeowners. Mm-hmm. So we have elected officials who feel that their constituency is not who's living in the district, it's who votes in those low turnout elections. And to this day, Seattle, Cambridge, Boulder have these off-year cycles. And it's a problem because it skews the turnout toward the people, the older voters who have different interests from the community.
Earlier today, you published an article on your website identifying the opportunity presented by the COVID-19 crisis in remaking cities. Most people have a hard time seeing any kind of opportunity right now, although I think we do, and we've had conversations with folks who are focused on education who say the same thing. And so tell us what you see here.
Well, do you guys know any restaurant owners?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
They're all, the restaurant industry is on life support, and it was projected by the Golden Gate Restaurant Association for San Francisco, which is a big restaurant town, that 50% may never reopen. Mm. So how do we get our restaurants to survive in a different environment? Well, we have to close off street for outdoor dining. I mean, outdoor dining is the really key solution, because most restaurants cannot survive. I don't know if any can survive with people having to be 6 feet apart, interior spaces. So that means the advocates, urbanists, have long sought to block off cars from taking over urban America. Here's an opportunity now to say, hey, we want to save restaurants. We have to do this. When you have restaurant heavy streets, block off the cars in the evening and have outdoor dining. It's a win-win for everyone. So that's the kind of opportunity. I also think that, what we've seen during this pandemic is so much medical involvement in talking about vulnerable populations. Well, those populations are primarily vulnerable because they live in overcrowded housing, not dense neighborhoods. There's a lot of misinformation about that, but really it's overcrowded housing. There's been a number of studies, and I talk about it in my article on Beyond Cron today. Well, we need medical experts to be more involved in housing now on all issues, because overcrowding preceded the pandemic and it's going to continue afterwards. How do you solve overcrowding? You build more units.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so you touched on it briefly, both at the beginning of the interview and in response to Candace's question. Public health is on everyone's mind right now. Why, just more broadly, why should we care from a public health perspective about housing? People will see those two things in silos, but now that we know that we're so interconnected.
Well, what's interesting, because I work in homelessness, I see a big rise in support for dealing with the unhoused, because now people realize when they get on their subway train, when they're going to a public event, they have a victory parade for a sporting event, or they go to, wait, the people around me, they're homeless and they're more vulnerable to disease, and I'm not safe. We got to get people housed. And I think there's going to be a lot of pressure as the people who've been temporarily housed due to the pandemic to keep them in permanent housing. And people say, hey, but the money hasn't been there. There's ways to get money, and I describe them in the book. And there's many cities that have bonds and specially set aside housing money, but we can't keep waiting for the federal government to come through, because it hasn't for 40 years. Maybe it will with a new president, but we need to act, cities and states need to act now, and philanthropists need to direct more money into housing, because for their own self-interest. And I think prior to this pandemic, a lot of people, they didn't like seeing homeless people on the street, but they didn't see those people as impacting their own health, and now they do.
Could I ask a follow-up question on that, Candace?
Yeah, sure.
So there, I know, at least in my experience, there's a lot of people that understand housing issues the same way you describe, but they are either unable to mobilize or really don't know where to start. How have you seen organizations be successful in manifesting the sort of progressive values behind the housing issues you've described?
Well, you've got group just right near Howard County, and in DC, the greater Washington, which is an example of how they're how they mobilize people, and people like Alex Baca and David Alpert, the founder, they're working on strategies, and it's making a difference. The mayor of DC is becoming more pro-housing, and I think I discussed in the book people in Cambridge, Jesse Beninoff in Cambridge, and Maya Rojas in San Diego. These are people who went to a hearing and said, I think we should build more housing. And people looked at them in the neighborhood, like, what are you doing here? Because it wasn't it was the neighborhood defender types who were there. And by them, they didn't have 10 people who were there before. And then people started hearing them speak, and they started saying, hey, wait a second, Jesse, this is in Cambridge. He formed an organization, A Better Cambridge. She formed YIMBY Democrats of San Diego. And suddenly the politics of both those cities have become more pro-housing. So if anyone's listening to this and saying they're very frustrated, they see bad scenarios of things not getting built in their neighborhood, someone's got to start. Someone's got to start. It's hard to do, but it's amazing how I describe in the book that communities that had no base, like in San Diego, which was always considered a very conservative town, it's becoming one of the most pro-housing places in America, of any major city.
And now we're going to ask you what your recommendation is for elected officials. Our podcast is based in Howard County, one of the richest jurisdictions in the state of Maryland. We have citizens and elected officials who consider themselves to be progressive, but are resistant to new housing. And so what's your recommendation to them, particularly our elected officials?
Well, I would say one of the most important messages, and I have this in the preface of the paperback, I say, what are the most important things that I want to emphasize again in the paperback? And that's, you really have to elect pro-housing folks. And, I talk in the book about, everyone was writing about about what happened in Minneapolis. They got rid of exclusionary zoning. That only happens because Lisa Bender was city council, was leading that. This affordability unlocked plan in Austin only happens because Gregorio Cesar, a great leader, was there. In this thing you were talking about earlier in Nolita, if council member Margaret Trin doesn't put her political future on the line to fight for senior housing in a wealthy neighborhood, never happens. So who you elect is really, really important. And the cities that don't elect really aggressive housing advocates don't get much housing built. There's a definite correlation.
I think it's a really good point. And to your point of electing people who are willing to do what's right and put their political career on the line is key.
And
it's hard to find those people. And I Margaret Trin is an exception. And most politicians do not want to build affordable housing in wealthy neighborhoods because they feel it's going to get killed politically. Yep. But some do.
So to build off of that, I mean, we here in Howard County, to be accused of being aligned with developers is seen, rightly or wrongly, as being a death sentence. We have elected officials who I know deep in their hearts understand the housing crisis, understand the consequences of not having enough housing, but they just can't get themselves over the idea of being seen aligned with developers. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, I mean, it's been a great strategy that anti-housing homeowner groups have used, is to call the evil developers when homeowners are making more money through appreciation. But I think what you really have to do is organize and mobilize people. I mean, what we've seen, like in my home, Berkeley, which has been maybe the NIMBY capital of America, students got involved who didn't used to be involved. And they changed the whole tenor of council meetings because all these students come out for housing. I think if you're in a community where there are people who support it, you have to get them out. I know Habitat chapters are very into advocacy, and I write about that in the book, how Habitat for Humanity we think of as like a service group, but they're actually more into advocacy. You have to do more of the outreach and build coalitions, and that takes work. It's not easy, but you can do that. And then when you see the actual people testifying, it's not the developer who's saying build it, it's the grocer, it's the small business person, it's the mother who wants her kids to be able to live somewhat near her. There's a lot of factors. A lot of seniors want to be able to have a fourplex in their single family home neighborhood. So you have to do that, and it's an organizing strategy.
Shall we get into elevator questions?
Let's do it.
All right. So these are the questions that we ask all of our guests at the end of our shows, and it allows our listeners to get to know a little bit more about you personally. What was the last book, movie, and music recommendation you made to a friend or family member?
Got to hit all three. So one book, one movie, music, and if it's just something that you want to recommend now, that's fine too.
Well, I read so many books, and I happen to read the most, to be honest, if I said the most recent book, the one I recommended just to someone the other day was a book about Willie Mays.
Oh,
if you can believe that.
Okay.
And the title, it was put out by James Hirsch as the author. It came out in 2010, and because a new book on Willie Mays came out, and I said, no, this other book was great. You know, you should check it out. I will recommend since it's on Amazon, you can watch it. And A French Village. Have you guys heard of that show?
no.
I had never heard of that show. Amazingly, it ran for 6 seasons, and it will make you feel better about being in the shelter in place, because these folks in this town in France were under Nazi control for 4 years. So what we're doing is nothing.
You know?
Okay.
How about music?
Well, Steve Earle has a new album out, and it just came out. You know Steve Earle, and he just has it's about the coal miners and all, and it's just coming out, and you might take a look at that, or I would say check out that, or Kathleen Edwards has some stuff out. I recommend people listen to WUMB. My wife and I, all of our music listening is based on a station based in Boston.
Okay.
Called WUMB, and you can get it streaming, WUMB, and they play great music all the time, no commercials.
Okay.
All right, so here's our tricky question that normally makes people pause, but you might be able to get it right away, which is, what is the most unpopular, benign opinion that you hold? So it is an unpopular opinion, but it is otherwise benign. So not like the other opinions we've been discussing today.
Unpopular, but benign.
Many people give food.
Well, I'd have to really think of that. Well, I would say this: I'm not a fan of barking dogs.
Okay.
And there's everyone seems to have a dog now.
Yes.
And yet, I sort of feel like if you have a dog, you shouldn't let it bark all the time. So that might be an unpopular, benign opinion.
We'll take that.
I just lost half my audience.
Like I said, we have a lot of elected officials on the show, so.
The cat lovers are all happy right now. What podcast, if any, are you listening to?
You know, I tend not to really listen to podcasts that much, to be honest with you. I'll listen to this, but I know people are really into podcasts, and everyone told me I should listen to David Simon on a Plot Against America, and I listened a little bit of it. But you know, when I'm driving, I used to drive. I used to go, you know, but I haven't listened to podcasts.
No, that's fine. I know that I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I often say to myself, I need to listen to more music, because it will even me out a little bit more. But
it'll calm you down.
Yes.
Check out WUMB.
I will. I'm definitely doing that. So we normally ask people, because we're interviewing a lot of Maryland folks, what the best meal in Maryland is. But even though many of our listeners may not get the opportunity to visit your fine state, what would you say is the best meal in California? And this needs to be something that someone can go out to a restaurant and buy.
Well, I have to be loyal. The truth is that Chez Panisse, which I live near in Berkeley, is Alice Waters' famous restaurant. It lives up to everything. And I would say it's a very special place. And it's worth a visit. You're in the Bay Area, when travel resumes and you come to the Bay Area, I'd also recommend a restaurant that I'm involved in the Tenderloin neighborhood called the Black Cat. It's a supper club. It's the only place where you can dinner and have live jazz.
Oh,
Heart
cool.
Tenderloin, the Black Cat. It's
Well,
closed
actually,
right now, but it'll be open soon.
Yeah, one of my
I
favorite
love supper
gas
clubs. I'm a
places in
fan.
New Orleans is called the Black Cat.
Very nice. All right. So what is the activity or hobby that you've rediscovered during this quarantine?
Well, I'm doing a lot more gardening because I'm home all the time. So I would say, I never gave it up, but it's a lot more time you have because you're home and you want to get exercise and go outside. Obviously doing a lot more walking. I always did that, but you do more of it because you're home.
Yeah.
What is the best advice you've ever received?
The best advice I ever received was, I heard a professor I had at law school who talked about how when he graduated law school, instead of doing what he really wanted to do and open his own practice, he felt he had to go join a big firm, and it was the biggest mistake he ever made. And I heard that and I said, when I graduate, even if there's no job, I'll see if I can get some funding to work for the Tenderloin Housing Clinic. And I did exactly what I wanted to do. And I always tell that to anyone with graduating college: don't just take a job unless you really need the money and you're in bad straits. But if you can afford not to, do what you want to do. And that's the key, because like both my daughters are public school teachers in San Francisco. They're doing work they enjoy. People who don't do work they enjoy, it's a terrible mistake.
Yeah,
Yep.
that's good advice. And the question that we end all of our interviews with is, what do you think we need to elevate this country?
Well, and this is one of the themes of Generation Priced Out that we didn't get to. Climate change is a bigger risk to this future than the pandemic. And housing and climate change the housing policy is climate policy, and I have whole sections in the book about that. And I mean, we kind of in this denial where, as long as we don't see the long car commutes, maybe it's not happening. But you have 140,000 people commuting every day before the pandemic, from Sacramento to the Bay Area. That's madness. The 2-hour commutes in Los Angeles, the freeways clogged all around America. That's madness. And we have to change it. And climate change, as we all know, continually gets short shift because we don't like dealing with discomfortable facts and uncomfortable things. Like, wait a minute, I have to, as you said earlier, Tom, about changing your lifestyle. Well, climate change requires that. But we don't want to talk about it. And that, to me, is really what as soon as this pandemic ends, we have to go back and talk about climate change.
Yeah. Well, Randy, thank you so much for coming on our show today. The work that you're doing out there is work that I believe in, and I talk about it often. We need to be considering in wealthy suburbs in Maryland, because housing is the connection to so many resources. As it relates to suburban life, it's the quality of education you might receive, and also the fact that we have many of our working class that can't afford to live here. So I call it a gated city, where the drawbridge goes down in the morning and then comes up at night. So thank you for all your work.
Well,
Yes,
thank you. And that's a great point. And thank you as well.
this was wonderful. Thank you so much. I will get to reading your book. I'm reading nothing except for things related to COVID-19 and diversity and inclusion right now, but I will get to your book. And so thank you so much for coming on the show.
Okay, thank you.
Appreciate it.